Hello, and welcome to the Momentum Ministry Partners podcast. This podcast is designed to provide that momentum in our God-given roles of leadership as we partner together to equip today's Christian leaders for tomorrow's opportunities. Thank you so much, and we hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello, and welcome back to another Momentum Ministry Partners podcast. My name is Eric Miller, and I'm your host for part 2 of a conversation that we started last week. Laurie Bohrer is here with us, and she is a clinical licensed counselor with a focus on trauma therapy. She's a chaplain with Pastor Dale Henneman. If that name sounds familiar, he was on an earlier episode or 2 episodes of our podcast back in season 1, and he talks about identifying anxiety and depression and then overcoming in those areas. So Laurie is a counselor on staff with Pastor Dale at Community Chaplain Services here in the Akron, Ohio area. Laurie, thank you for joining us for another episode.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself. We kind of did an intro in the last episode, but dive a little deeper into the dynamics of your family. You said you're married, you have 3 kids, 15 to 18. Tell us a little bit about your family. What do you guys like to do?
Oh, well, we love to travel if we could. We don't travel a lot.
Sure.
But my husband's a big adventurer and I'm not. So when he pulls us out of our shells, we tend to do some pretty fantastic things. So that's something about our family. We do really well together.
That's awesome.
Going to a movie or doing things like that. And then when we don't do well, we're all up in our rooms and we're, teenage isolation.
On our devices. And yeah.
That's right. And on the devices. And so we are like your typical family, and anytime I come in with any word of advice, it's don't therapy me, mom. Like,
okay.
I'm not allowed to be counselor in the house.
Man, they play that card.
They play that card. So does husband. Husband plays that card too. Wait, are you therapying me? I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm trying to have a nice conversation with you.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, forgive us of any background noise to our listeners. They're mowing the grass outside, so it is summertime, and we'll just acknowledge that and move on. So, Laurie, thank you for joining us on this episode. This is part 2 of a conversation we're really wanting to aim at providing a resource that parents and pastors, as they walk with your teenagers, as you learn to navigate those wild mood swings that teenagers can go through. Last episode, we talked a lot about how those things are actually healthy and how we as the adults in their lives get to help disciple them and point them to Jesus and love them in ways where it's to their benefit. So if you're starting out with this episode and you didn't listen to part 1, we'd highly encourage you to go back, check that one out. But today we wanted to dive a little bit deeper. There's this whole other side of crisis. What do we do as parents and adults when we're watching our loved ones, children especially, maybe it's students in your youth ministry, but as they walk through points of crisis? That is such a big deal. First of all, Laurie, let's define, what do we mean when we say crisis? How does that differentiate from what we talked about on last episode?
Yes.
Where there's just natural things going on.
Yeah, so teenage life is turbulent, especially emotionally inside and in their brains. There's a lot going on. And we talked about that. And then we talked about some of the responses of the pandemic and that nervous system adjustment and feeling more depression or more anxiety because of that. But when we start to see even a low-level dysfunction in their life that doesn't seem to fit their norm because they're all different, then we want to start to open our eyes to that, because they're not always great at coming to us with vulnerable issues and problems, especially ones they don't understand. I don't know why I'm sad and I can't figure it out. Sounds really vulnerable to go and tell somebody. Or I'm anxious and I don't know why I have shortness of breath in this certain class, and they feel shamed by it, right? Yeah. So as parents, we want to try to spot when crisis can start to become a cue that they are dysregulating.
Yeah. Wow.
Temporary, sometimes temporary, sometimes not, but the earlier the better.
Okay, so give me some other examples of what a crisis might be for teenagers. Maybe things that you've seen or just hypothetical things that could be going on in a student's life. Obviously, depression, obviously the mental health side of all that. You gave some stats on last episode about the rise of anxiety and the awareness of mental health it is totally normal right now to see a student self-identify even as dealing with panic attacks or anxiety or depression. In some ways, they're probably self-diagnosing that.
Yes, and usually overdiagnosing.
Yes.
And putting a lot of there. On the one hand, it's so great that mental health is becoming on the forefront and it's more comfortable to talk about. But also, we have the internet,
Right.
where we can go in and fit ourselves into any diagnosis we want to.
Yeah.
And so, really, kind of getting that dialogue with a professional or with your parents, those type of things are so helpful in the beginning of a crisis.
Okay.
Right, because we can.
Yeah.
Adults, we can diagnose ourselves. I mean, when I was in school, I had all the diagnoses, you know.
Sure. So we're talking like death of a loved one,
Death of a loved one,
like parents
bullying,
getting divorced.
divorce, being kind of X'd out of your friendship group,
Yeah.
self-esteem,
Okay.
not making a football team,
Yep.
all the way up to
Yeah.
clinical anxiety, suicidal thoughts.
Yep.
There's a whole spectrum of crisis, and crisis can be good too. It with the Lord, it changes our character and builds resilience. And we need resilience built for us in order to become adults and be in the real world. But also we need the help of those around us who can spot times when it's just not going in a healthy direction.
That's good. Yeah. Man, you're playing the counselor card and the Bible card.
Yeah.
That's one verse that like James 1:2-3 that sometimes I wish I could just like omit from the Bible. Consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. I'm like, really, God? Really? I got to consider this joyful, but okay. But yeah. And like even verse 12 then talks about like, blessed is the man who has endured through those trials, because exactly what you just said, you're able to see how God works and your perspective shifts. And that's how I think we build our faith and our character grows. All right, so let's dive in.
So Pastor Dale coined the term sow joy.
Ooh.
When we talk about sow joy, it's holding sorrow in the one hand and joy in the other. And that happens in grief, it happens in crisis, but we don't have to have one or the other. We can experience both, and that can be confusing and wonderful at the same time. But we decided like it needs a name. We decided sow joy was the name.
I like that. Jeff makes up names or words all the time, so that fits very in line with this podcast.
Yes, I'm on a mission to create all the things that the teenagers saying like mid and
yes.
So I've decided that I'm going to like start my own movement. So I've been saying that's so choice to my kids to see if it moves through. And the other day, my daughter actually said in the car like, "That's so choice that happened." Like, that's a good thing. I'm like, okay, it's going to be coined by me someday.
There you go. Now it's recorded on a podcast.
Yeah,
we'll put that clip on our social.
Right. That's a choice.
There you go. All right. So what do we do as parents as we watch our teenagers or our children, our loved ones walk through crisis? What's kind of first steps? How do you engage? What do you do?
One of the first steps is don't panic. Don't panic. They need somebody around them to be grounded and calm, because if we go to the level of panic, if there's suicidal thoughts or depression or anxiety or even things going on at school that we want to jump in and fix or call somebody else's parent, it then becomes unsafe for them to come to us, right? So we don't want to panic. We want to be able to regulate our own reactions, because it's scary.
Sure.
As parents, to see your kids acting different or to start isolating or to not talk about things. And so really trying to manage our own emotions, and that would be step number one.
Now, explain that a little deeper, because some parents are going to hear, don't call a counselor, don't get them help, but you're saying don't panic.
In the moment.
Yeah, so what does that look like?
You've come to me and I'm saying, hey, buddy, your grades are down. Some stuff's going on. What's going on? They don't want to talk.
Yeah.
Then it finally comes out like, I don't know, I feel sad. I don't know why,
Yeah.
Okay, not panicking is, oh my gosh, are you and I've been guilty of that because I'm a counselor. We see it all. So it's really hard for me not to panic, but
you react in a very overwhelming, crazy, negative
and then
way.
they're even more scared. Like, wait, what? I missed,
Oh, I'm really broken, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, they feel bad.
And so in that moment, not panicking, but thoughtfully seeking help is going to be imperative, whether it's your physician, the pediatrician, a counselor, sometimes even medication, but like, it's okay to ask for help. But first, don't panic and normalize it for them. Yeah, that's very common. I remember at 15, I was pretty low for a while too. And,
Okay.
and so normalizing it, not
Yeah.
panicking.
Yep.
Their crisis is okay. We can handle your crisis, and we're going to love you through it. And we're also going to go through the proper channels to really get you help.
Good. All right. So what if your kids won't talk to you? You're like, I know something's going on, but I'm not sure I can put my finger on it. Hey, your friend that you hung out with, your bestie, your BFF is not around anymore. Like, what's going on? Like, where are they? Like, but they won't tell you. Like, how do you like sit them down and interrogate them? Do you take them to the basement and like put them in that chair with the single light bulb hang? Like, what does that look like for you as a mom and also a counselor? Help us think that through.
Well, I would say that would go on the list of what not to do.
Okay. I figured.
But holding space for them to, even asking general questions like, are you okay? Are you, do you want to talk about it? One of the great things with my kids is when we're driving in the car, they don't have to make eye contact.
Yeah.
They don't have to feel like they're confessing anything. You just get on this line of discussion.
Yeah.
And they start to say, yeah, I haven't talked to so-and-so because she thinks I did this and there's all these things. Oh, and then you can be that part, right? When we talked about being a part, the acronym part, be present with them,
Yep.
be empathetic with them, right? And be able to hold space for that.
That's good. I think so. I think it was Brad Dietz Creek maybe on one of these episodes. He was talking about oftentimes as parents we want to get eye to eye and like I'm going to take them to coffee and we're going to sit down and we're going to hash this out and we're going to talk. And to a teenager, that very much feels like my illustration of, I'm going to take you down to the musty basement with the single light bulb. Like it's an interrogation, but I like what you're saying, like get shoulder to shoulder.
Shoulder to shoulder.
And so maybe that's doing a project together. Maybe that's like going for a drive. Maybe it is, like let's go to a movie and talk about the movie or like whatever it is. But finding a way to get shoulder to shoulder can be less intimidating. But then you said it, ask really good questions of like what's going on.
Open questions.
Maybe identifying even. Is that helpful? Like, hey, it seems like you're going through something. Is that helpful? Or
yes,
no?
that's very helpful. And then what's great to say that is that am I on track with that? Am I right? And give them permission to disagree with you.
Good.
Right? Now that's not really it, Mom, but something over here is going on or whatever. And they may not even give you all the information, but to say like, I'm dealing with something, I talked to so-and-so. And some of their friends, please don't go to that friend because they're going to give you
Right.
We can't say that,
Sure.
right? To be able to say like, sometimes an adult perspective might be helpful. Who do you think you might want to talk to? And maybe it's Nate at church or this, and
Yep.
And so creating that prepared parenting, like you talk about, is, building that team around you so that if they're not comfortable with you, they can go to somebody else. But just in crisis, just relying on their peers is not usually a good thing. And it's a lot of pressure on their peers.
Yeah.
It's a lot for them to hold as well.
Yeah. I think sometimes for us as parents, even it's good to have the people who have walked these roads or these paths that are further down or further ahead of us than we are, where we can lean on them. We can ask them for their wisdom and perspective for us. But that in this scenario could also be helpful. Like, hey, like I actually know somebody, maybe it's you, but maybe it's somebody else. Like I know somebody who's been through that. Like, would you be willing to like, if I set up a conversation, again, asking the question rather than you're going to.
Right. Asking permission.
Yeah.
It's so good. And there's times when you don't ask permission, right? If they're
Sure.
suicidal or they're
Sure.
harm to themselves, like you're going to do anything you can and you
Yep.
can let them know, I'm going to do everything I can to keep you safe. And that might mean going to the ER or going to this. And so, all bets are off when there's self-harm and suicidal stuff going on.
Yeah. All right. So, spiritually speaking, okay, again, we want to follow a pattern here. We're talking about like a lot of things that can go on mentally, emotionally, but we want to consider the spiritual ramifications of all this. How do you walk alongside of them spiritually when you know they're wrestling, and maybe you see it? Maybe you're a youth pastor and you're like, I feel like they're pulling away from the Lord. What do you do in those moments? Any advice there?
Sometimes the platitudes don't help. Like God is in control, or the the Christianese things that we can say to help people
Just
feel
prayed about
better.
it?
Yeah, have you prayed about it? God, there's a purpose, and He'll ordain everything for good. But to say like, can we put it in the hands of the Lord? What does it look like to give it into the hands of the Lord?
Yeah.
And you watch them soften, or they get angry. And then you're able to say, hey, God wants our anger too.
Yep.
So can we just give it all to him?
Right.
And those are simple statements to make, and they're then deciding the path they're going to take for it.
Yep.
And then behind the scenes, guess what? We're on our knees praying
For sure.
over the top for everything that we want them to receive from the Lord. But sometimes isolation, we can't just flip a switch off and not isolate from God. We're isolating from parents and friends. We're going to isolate from God too, right?
Yeah.
And especially if there's shame involved, if there's guilt and shame involved in choices or habits, being able to say, hey, God's not fragile, like his love isn't fragile.
Yep.
And guess what? Our love isn't fragile. And you can come to us with anything,
That's good.
and our love isn't fragile. Because sometimes there's some shameful things that they really don't want to talk about, and that leads to depression and really dark thinking. And just remind them, like, hey, you may not tell us, but like, hey, like, there's nothing that you're going to say that's going to
Right.
cause us to
Yeah.
love you less, or for God to love you any
Yeah.
less.
We talked last episode about the parents needing to really understand that you're the primary discipler, the spiritual leader in your teenager's life. So even in this process, how can we model that? How do you when you know that they're struggling, maybe you're not as much, but you're watching that your heart's breaking for them. You feel that the pain that they're feeling. How do you even engage in that on that level of like modeling or being an example, discipling them?
You might just get on their level and share something really vulnerable that you went through, right? Because it's our testimony and his truth
Yep.
that breaks brokenness, right? And so, like, hey, let me give you some of my testimony. And you may think I'm this, 50-year-old parent who doesn't know what it's like to be a teenager anymore. And yes, the culture in the world is so different, but the basic theme of feeling disconnected or unwanted, I felt that before.
Yeah.
And here's how I felt. Then they feel like they're not in it alone,
Yep.
right? We're attuning to them.
Yep.
We're attuning to them.
Yeah.
And that can be discipleship. And then modeling how God has worked in your life
Yep.
and how it doesn't look pretty all the time, and that it's not this easy answerable thing that we're going to move through. And I don't know what's going to come out of this,
Right.
but I know what God has done for me, and I'm with you in it.
Yep.
So let me be grounded in my spiritual walk with Jesus, even if you're not.
Yep. That's good. Yeah. One of my favorite phrases to say is vulnerability breeds vulnerability. And when you're willing to like open up and share something vulnerable. And I think in this case, you're giving us a good principle or a good tool that like, as we look at the heart of the issue, or even if they're able to pinpoint what it is for us, they feel like they got betrayed or they lost trust in somebody or whatever it is, then you can step into that and give a vulnerable moment of when you felt betrayed or when you were whatever. So that's good. I like that a lot.
And
Yeah.
not having the lofty answers sometimes when they have those questions about, well, why did God let this happen? Was it
Yeah.
one of my responses is, we're just not going to know everything until we're on the other side,
Right.
And so being able to say, I don't know, can be powerful as well, because then you're also in those trenches together.
Yep. So at what point then, Laurie, do we ask for help? When do we, at what point do we say, I'm crying, uncle, I need to tap out. I can't, I've been walking with you through this. I'm doing my best. I don't know how to help anymore. Like, what does that process look like?
Okay, so I'll give you some ways to spot
Okay.
when a child's in crisis, but also in a healthy way. As toddlers proximity seek, right? They look at their parent, they go play, they look back, right? And it's a very short duration. Teenagers re-engage in proximity seeking as well, but they go out with their peers and they have this life, and then they come in at times and check in and share, and then they go out, but it's for much longer periods,
Yep.
like that funnel effect,
Yeah.
right? That is a sign of health.
Gotcha.
When they're not checking in at all, then we need to start watching. So how to tell if something's wrong when they don't talk, sleeping more than the usual, right? So we talked about how teenagers can sleep in, they can sleep all day. But if this is an issue of loss of energy or, it's just out of the typical for them,
Yeah.
their unique physical need,
Yep.
then we want to watch that.
All they want to do is sleep.
loss of energy, loss of pleasure. Like you go out with their friends, you have fun. It was fine. And that's not normal for them. Normally they're like, yeah, that was great. Or why don't you call so-and-so and go to the mall with them? It's like, nah, I don't want to. You start watching. Grades drop. Very tell sign. If they're a straight A student and they're getting C's and D's, something's going on. Isolation, not interested in engaging with family. That's normal. But they refuse to come up, like they're not hungry for dinner and they're not, so you have the eating changes and you have the energy changes and the sleep changes. All those basic needs are changing, then something's going on.
Okay.
Irritation. Irritation in boys can equate to sadness. So maybe girls might have tears and be crying, but adults, children, teenagers, they can show anxiety and depression through just being irritable. And, I'm not sad. Well, we can be depressed and not be sad. We can be numbed out and irritable instead of sad. Right. And so watching if they're super irritable and they're not normally like that, then that's a sign. Changes in friendships, friends, good friends not coming around.
Yeah.
Hey, what's going on there? Yeah. And hints about not wanting to be around, hopelessness, hints about not wanting to be around. We want to pay attention to that and really dig into what that really means and get help for that.
Give us some examples. What might that look like?
Just be better off if I wasn't here, or I should just shoot myself. And they're laughing and it's joking. It's never a joke.
Yeah,
it's never a joke.
Would miss me anyways.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
And asking them the question is not going to cause them to think about it more, because some parents can be afraid to say, "Hey, buddy,
That's good.
Are you thinking that you don't want to live anymore? Are you planning something?" They usually can be honest about the answers, and us not asking is not a solution to the problem. Asking the question actually brings it into the open, and light drowns out the darkness, right? Jesus drowns out the darkness. So to get honest about what they're going through, they'll typically be relieved that somebody's asking them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And normalizing it. Hey, a lot of kids feel this way in the teenage years. Like, how can I help you? Can we talk to the pediatrician and see if maybe we can do a survey and check in with her? Can I get you some counseling?
Yeah.
And just really being aware of that. And if there's, if they have a plan and they're, you want to take it seriously 100% of the time.
Yeah. Good. All right. So let's go a little deeper. Let's keep going down this dark path we're on.
Let's go.
In this crisis point, okay, Laurie, if your student, your child, they say, yes, Mom, I am having suicidal thoughts. I am, addicted to drugs or alcohol or like it is serious. Now what? Like, where do you go? What do you do? What are the first steps that you'd recommend?
Yeah. At that point, we're not turning to them and asking them permission anymore. We're going outside and we're getting help, and we're rallying up a new team along with the old team and letting everybody know this is what's going on. And the hope is that we're connecting them with this person, and that counseling is necessary at that point.
Yeah.
And it's so hopeful because there's so many different type of behavioral skills that really help teenagers through the suicidal ideation. And a lot of kids have suicidal thinking, but they never have a plan. They actually don't want to die. It can be intrusive thinking. It can actually be a part of anxiety. And only a professional is going to recognize the difference.
Sure.
And they're going to be able to psychoeducate the client's parents. Here's what we do. We have protocols. We're going to do a verbal contract. We're going to do a written contract. Can I have you take everything out of the house? Like, there's protocols that we are trained to encourage the parents to engage in, and then then the parents feel like they have power. Like there is some sense of control in it. We can control that he's not going to get into any danger in our home.
Yeah.
And so that relationship with the parents in counseling is just as impactful as counseling the client themselves.
It's remembering again that you're the parent and that you're the primary discipler in your child's life. And so like laying out the plan, communicating. I think I learned this phrase from Brene Brown, like unclear is unkind. And so like as a mom and dad, like this is what we're going to do. Here's the plan. So, and I've learned from my own trauma and crisis, as a growing up in adolescence and even into being a young adult, like if you don't know, and maybe you don't know to articulate the entire 10 steps of the plan, but like by giving what you do know and saying, we'll reevaluate when we get to this point, those things can be tremendously helpful of here's what we're going to do. We're going to get you some help. We're going to sit down with pastor at church. They're going to connect us to a good biblical counselor in the community, whatever. And then we'll go and meet with them. And then they're going to ask you some, like, be clear with the things that you know. I mean, I know you know this because we've talked about this before, but
that's right.
Those are the things that I think help the student the most, where then you're stepping into your authority, your primary discipling role as mom and dad, and you're helping to be very clear. And when there are those things where you're like, I don't know what the end result of that conversation with the counselor will be, you know, you may need to go, I think it's okay. Is that fair to like put that on the table? Like we may have you go every week for a while. It probably won't be forever.
Yeah, it's like going to a doctor.
Yeah.
The counselor's probably going to say, hey, let me see you every week for the next 8 weeks and we'll reevaluate. Letting the counselor lead that, the professional lead that, because they typically know whether if they're in crisis, they're going to typically go every week, maybe every other week, but they're probably not going to go once a month, right? And so listening to the counselor in that, but also really being able to connect with normalizing it for them. Like it is very common for teenagers to have those kind of thoughts, and they're intrusive. They're not necessarily suicidal thinking, but they have an intrusive thought pop in their head, and then they're so afraid of it that they hold on to it. But it's really just an anxious thought that needed to just move in and out. Right. And talking to a counselor, they realize that, and all the pressure's off. You know, I remember looking at one of my journals from my teenage years, and I read that I wish I wasn't around anymore. I wrote that. I don't ever remember being suicidal. I don't have a history of depression. I wrote that in my journal. I'm like, oh, yeah, like teens can have these weird thoughts. Yep. And they're like, we talked about the amygdala, those intense emotional reactions are going to be in everything, right? And so it doesn't mean that you want to die because you're thinking about hopelessness or, you know.
For sure. Yeah, good. All right, so I had another question on that regard. When you're like walking with your student through that, do you think, and maybe this is your mom hat on, I know you're taking hats on and off here. But,
I am the audience as well.
If in this context, when you're thinking about like, hey, like I know, I appreciate you told me you're addicted to drugs right now. We're going to get you some help. At what point do you play or do you not play the role of accountability partner for your child? Would you recommend that? How does that go south? Like, what does that look like?
I think that's a fine line, right? When they're in crisis, they need to be accountable for showing up. Like, I can't tell you how many teenage clients I have that are forced to be there.
Sure.
And then after a few sessions, they actually enjoy because there's a space for them to just dump, right? Yeah. And they like it. But a lot of times the teenager's not coming in under their own will, but it's the best thing the parent could do for them.
Yeah.
And addiction, same thing. The parent might need to take steps and have harsh boundaries and hold them accountable for certain things. The one thing they can't be accountable is for their own recovery, right? They then have to let them intrinsically want to be better.
Yeah. I like that. It is a very fine line. And I think there's this tension at times between trying to, like, you want the best for your kids, and so you're going to ask them and hold them. Your heart might be right, your intentions might be good. You're trying to hold them accountable, but really what they need you to do is create an environment where they can succeed. And so I like hey, these are the guidelines. This is our contract. This is what we'll agree to, and then I'm going to, trust that you're going to keep working the process, right? I have seen, and maybe this is just my experiences in being a pastor for a long time, but I have seen the stricter the parent, the sneakier the kid.
Well, because we can't go in and be the behavior they need to be, right?
Yes.
We can't go in and do that for them because then that's codependency.
And it goes
right?
back to that we talked on last episode of like we're looking for behavior modification rather than heart change.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
All right. So Laurie, last question, I think. How do parents get help? Because this is hard. This is a hard path to walk when your teenagers are in crisis, your kids are in crisis, and you're walking with them. Where do parents go to find support or help, encouragement?
What I see at my clinical counseling agency is we have clients come in and they'll go for a while, and then the parent will start to go. They'll start to come in and talk about their own stuff instead of just checking in. And we're able to say, hey, maybe this is a time for you to match with this counselor so that you can get support and more education, and you can like process this experience for you, because this has to be hard for you, because if our kid's in crisis, aren't we in crisis too? Like the mama bears, we don't like our kids in crisis, and it's so easy. God gave us such a sense of connection as mothers to feel what we feel, and we want so bad to take it away from them. And that can be detrimental to their healing. So we need to go outside and seek our own help in that. And there's great Christian counseling agencies. I'm at Renew Christian Counseling. We have the chaplaincy. We have great Christian counselors all over town that integrate biblical truth with clinical psychological counseling.
If you don't have that, ask your church. I'd say start there. Talk to one of your pastors. Most churches, most pastors have a group, a counseling company, or somebody that they trust and know and partner with. But also some of that for parents, I think that help, that community can be found in just joining a life group. Maybe it's attending services more regularly. There's an idea. Maybe it's like even pressing into your own relationship with the Lord, and you need to get back out your prayer journal, and you need to get on your knees, like you were saying earlier, about like bringing these requests to the Lord and seeing Him work. I think it's imperative in these situations to remember that we cannot, as much as we'd like to, we cannot play the role of the Holy Spirit in someone else's life.
That's ding, 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 ding. That's
he has to do
it.
His job. Yeah,
that's it. And and I think for there are usually people in the church that have gone through what you're going through, and let them cover you in prayer and let them normalize for you what they went through with their kids. There's lots of parents in larger churches with kids in college that can say, oh yeah, we struggle with that with so-and-so. And here's what I wish we wouldn't have done. And you just get so much wisdom from it. And the other hand of it, I think what you're saying is like taking care of yourself and your own spiritual journey and being able to be healthy spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally for the crisis, and not letting go of that and self-sacrifice in order to fix your kid.
Yeah, for sure.
For
sure. Laurie, thank you. This is really
welcome.
good. This is really good. Parents, pastors, as you're listening to our audience, if this is helpful for you, please share this with somebody else that might be benefited by it. We always would love to hear feedback, so you can obviously rate and review this episode or our podcast as a whole. But if you have questions, if there's a way that we can serve you or be a resource to you, you're always welcome to submit those questions to us via our social media. You can direct message us. You can even email your questions to us at info@buildmomentum.org. That's our email address that we do monitor and look at, and we respond to those questions. And many of our episodes, including some of this context in this conversation, have been birthed out of listeners sending those questions in. So thank you for doing that. We really appreciate you tuning in to another episode of the Momentum Ministry Partners podcast. Thanks so much.
Well, guys, I think that's going to do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. We'd be really honored if you went ahead and subscribed to the podcast, and that way you can just kind of stay up to date with the episodes that we're posting in the future. To learn more about Momentum Ministry Partners and our many other resources, please be sure to follow us on social media at Momentum Ministry Partners, or check out our website, www.buildmomentum.org.